We appreciate your time and are grateful to you for plugging this into what I am sure is your very busy day. We begin these colloquia with the land acknowledgement from Michigan State University. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. I'll put in the chat after I'm done links to further resources on land acknowledgements and the MSU land acknowledgement in particular, if you're interested. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium is a regular forum organized by the Center for Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. It's designed to highlight the innovative and important interdisciplinary work that involves arts and humanities at Michigan State. Interdisciplinarity at major universities, as many of you probably know, is often code for well-funded complex science. But some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work reflects an appreciation for aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience, broadly construed. The UIC is really an attempt to provide kind of a forum for people who approach interdisciplinarity from slightly different directions than might be considered the norm at a place like MSU. And we want to use this as a forum to amplify the contributions that people like our speaker today are making to the fields in which they're working, and also interdisciplinary research more generally. We meet every other week in the fall and the spring. And this year, all of the talks will be on Zoom. So please, you have this time at some point in the future available, consider joining us again. The question and answer session after Dr. Moore's talk today will proceed as follows. I just kind of want to give you a heads up about this. After Dr. Moore finishes, while Dr. Moore is delivering her presentation, if you have a question, please put it in the Zoom chat or use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. So whenever you have the question, just put it down into the system. And after Dr. Moore is finished with her remarks, I'll read them out for response in the order that they were asked. So again, that makes it slightly more interactive a little bit, and we're hoping that you'll have lots of questions today. The next University Interdisciplinary Colloquium will be Friday, October 15th from 12 to 1, again on Zoom. The link you used today will work for that talk as well. Our speaker will be Dr. Laura Dilley, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders in the College of Communication Arts and Sciences at MSU. And Dr. Dilley will give a talk entitled QAnon Propaganda on Twitter as Information Warfare. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Sharlissa Moore. Dr. Moore is an Associate Professor in James Madison College at MSU. She works at the intersections of energy, equity, and climate change. For more than a decade, she has led research and policy analysis on energy systems with significant interdisciplinary experience, including research on clean energy, deployment, environmental justice, and socioeconomic analyses. Her current work focuses on stakeholder perspectives related to developing large-scale solar power on agricultural lands. Today, she's with us to deliver a talk entitled Interdisciplinary Energy Research, Needs, Challenges, and Pathways Forward. Dr. Moore.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to share my screen with my slides. Give me a shout out if you can't see that. So I'm excited to be talking today about interdisciplinary energy research. And I'm going to start with kind of the 30,000 foot view of why we need interdisciplinary and also transdisciplinary research on energy. And I'm going to give 3 examples of my work in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary energy research. And then I want to spend a little bit of time also reflecting on the institutional challenges that we face to really promote this type of research and make it work. And I'll suggest a few solutions as well. So first of all, in terms of why interdisciplinary research is so important for energy, I should mention up front that, of course, energy policy and energy systems change are very important for climate change mitigation. And we really need all different types of disciplines participating in this challenge. And there's some literature that argues that energy is really more of a social challenge than a technological one. The standard view would be that it's a technological challenge. I would argue, like many scholars in science and technology studies, that it's really a socio-technical challenge, that it's really that intersection between the design of the technology and the social institutions and actors that makes the energy design and deployment challenge so important for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. So this Venn diagram a little bit clumsily tries to illustrate that. So on one side, we have some of the social and policy institutions and actors and factors, and that includes our utility companies, which are quite diverse and different in different states, our regulatory agencies, which are also somewhat diverse at the state level. So ours is the Michigan Public Service Commission, a federal Department of Energy, energy activists, consumers, citizens, and of course the money at stake and the state government organizations. On the technology side, we have, of course, the transmission grid. We have various generation technologies. We have proposals for more distributed energy and doing away with part of our transmission grid. And then at the bottom is the Shiraz coal-fired power plant in Marquette, Michigan, which retired quite recently and is part of a broader trend toward coal retirements within the next decade or two across the US, which is giving us this fantastic opportunity for scaling up clean energy, but a lot of challenges about how you do that in an equitable way and how you do it quickly enough to address climate change. So when I'm talking about interdisciplinary energy research, I just want to emphasize, and I'm sure this isn't new for this audience, that I'm really talking about research that produces new knowledge across disciplines. So multidisciplinary research would be simply additive, bringing together the different disciplines to do a part of this project, a part of an energy project, but instead talking about actually integrating to produce new knowledge, which I think is much more challenging. Then when I talk about transdisciplinary research, I'm talking about research that has a whole systems approach, which is so important for energy, electricity, energy for transportation, but also intersections with food systems and water systems. I'm also talking about research that includes public engagement. And for me, as somebody who studies energy justice, I place a lot of importance on public engagement that promotes procedural justice and distributive justice and the equity of outcomes that come out of a public engagement and stakeholder engagement process. Then I think cross-sector involvement is very important in transdisciplinary research as well. So with energy, we have the industry actors who are quite powerful. We have policymakers working at different scales from federal to state to local to international. We have our national lab system. We have all of these different actors who play a really important role in energy, but are not always in conversation with one another. And then the third broad point I would make about transdisciplinary energy research or interdisciplinary energy research is that I think it really requires explicit training to do well, to go beyond the multidisciplinary to the inter and transdisciplinary. And ideally, we would start that early in young scholars' careers, but I also don't think that just because you didn't have an interdisciplinary PhD training program that there aren't ways to start to acquire that education and training and experience later on. And I think C4I is an excellent organization on campus for starting to facilitate that. I also think we need explicit methods for enabling cooperation, like C4I's toolbox and other modes of collaboration. So I'm really interested in the role of visualization in helping scholars to communicate across disciplines and stakeholders to communicate across sectors. So I'll give my 3 brief examples now. So perhaps the most commonly discussed example of why interdisciplinary energy research is needed is because that there's a significant human behavior component in energy systems change. So we need people to kind of behave in ways that reflect their values, or we want to see people value sustainability more. And then we would like to see that play out in people's purchases. I think there's a lot of other examples that go beyond this that I'll talk about next, but this is kind of the classic one. So at MSU, I worked on a project with Professor Annick Anctil in engineering, looking at remanufactured batteries from electric vehicles. So we're at a stage right now in our energy transition where our first electric vehicle fleet is about ready to be retired. It's about a decade into its life, and we're going to have a lot of batteries that we have to figure out something to do with. They're lithium-ion batteries. We don't want to see them just disposed in landfills, but instead either recycled or repurposed for home energy use, either for replacing a natural gas generator for reliability, or for use with a home energy system. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of techno-economic challenges involved in this question. So how much charge is left in the battery? It can be about 90%. And can it withstand additional stresses? So Dr. Anctil and her graduate students have been stress testing these batteries. What kinds of processes are required for remanufacturing the battery? So there's that technical piece and manufacturing piece. We also want to make sure that this does actually improve the environmental impacts after you have put additional inputs into it. So she and her team are experts in environmental life cycle assessment to measure that. And then how much will these batteries cost? So those are some main techno-economic challenges. The social behavioral challenges for this question hadn't really been considered. There was a little bit of literature for us to draw on, but not much. So typically the classic question is, will people adopt them? Are consumers going to buy these? But for this question, it was kind of interesting because we have an example of basically a used technology. So at what cost would people adopt a used or repurposed battery, and at what warranty lengths? And then we also wondered, for those early adopters who already own solar systems or who have an electric vehicle that's about to retire, will these people who are typically focused on the latest and greatest technology be willing to adopt something that they might perceive as used even after remanufacturing? And how much less would they expect to pay for this technology? We also wondered, once we move past that first wave of adoption, how will the adoption rate change, and how will the perceptions of the consumer groups change over time? There might need to be design changes to the technology, or kind of at least changes to marketing practices. So what kind of information will consumers want as they're making this decision between a new versus a repurposed battery? What do they expect it to look like? So this PowerVault battery here, I think, is a decently aesthetically appealing battery. There are some that look much more industrial with, exposed wires and things like that. So what are their aesthetic expectations, particularly given that these batteries will likely be in people's garages? That's the current regulatory requirement. And then what kind of risks do consumers perceive? Do they think there will be safety risks? Are they worried about fire? Are they worried about ongoing maintenance costs? For the early adopters who have solar already, this is still a very expensive option because all of the installation costs are the main parts of the cost, not the actual physical batteries themselves. So a retrofit is expensive. It's much cheaper if you do it along with the solar system. And then a lot of data is collected with some of these battery designs. So do people have privacy concerns? So we decided not to just look at the public as a whole, but to select an early adopter group and a general public group. And we did 2 separate surveys of those groups nationally, and then 2 separate focus groups here in the Lansing area. So this project was funded by Ford Motors through the Ford MSU Alliance. So in some sense, it was really helpful to have a company that has these electric vehicle batteries that are going to be retiring soon, to think through what is the market for this and to work with them in a real world context about what their needs are. There were also certainly challenges of managing, corporate dimensions and influence in the work. So what we found was across the two groups, there's actually pretty similar opinions of these remanufactured batteries, which are labeled as SLBs in this diagram here. So initially, so far these have been called second life batteries. One thing we surveyed on was, what do people think of that term? And we found it was actually pretty unfavorable. So even renaming this could affect consumer preferences. So about the same opinion across these two groups. So for the early adopter groups, they were a little bit more favorable of the second life of the remanufactured battery than the general public. Then when we asked what are your preferences between adopting a new or a remanufactured battery, it was also pretty similar. There's a bit more of a preference for the new battery from the early adopters compared to the general public. So while we didn't find major overall differences in opinion, we did find real differences in the regression analysis. I also want to mention that I'm not really a survey researcher typically. So I kind of adjusted my methods to the question that the industry and my engineering colleagues were interested in asking. So this was kind of a new area for me to I'd done surveys before, but to choose regression analysis, a way of measuring opinions, I typically use interview research. But it was really interesting to see how the correlated variables were really different across the two groups, which might mean that after the first wave of adopters, there would need to be redesigns to the technology or the business model or the advertising at the least. So for the early adopters, we actually found that even though they tend to like the latest and greatest technology, they kind of saw the remanufactured batteries as just that, as opposed to seeing them as used or somewhat outdated. And since some of them own an EV battery already, they saw them as really well engineered. The early adopters who see themselves as do-it-yourselfers had a more favorable opinion of the remanufactured compared to the new battery. And then the only thing that we found that was negatively correlated with this remanufactured battery opinion was if somebody had a net metering program where they were feeding energy into the grid that they were satisfied with. But since those rates are changing pretty quickly, as that rate is a big rate-making issue across different regulatory public service commissions across the United States, this could mean that people's opinions really shift of this as their net metering rate or program changes. So for the general public, we found that their preference for a second life battery had much more to do with their overall opinion of solar panels, whether they saw solar as matching their political ideology, if they were concerned about e-waste, which makes a lot of sense, and if they self-assess their knowledge of batteries to be high compared to other people. And the main thing we found that was interesting is we were trying to see what an analogy might be with another kind of used product for opinion of second life batteries. So we found for the general, there wasn't one really for the early adopters, but for the general public, people who had a much higher opinion of used cars tended to favor the second life batteries. And we also found for both adopter groups, if you had less education, less formal education for the early adopters, or for the general public, less income, they actually perceived the new battery. And there's some literature that suggests that's because people with less education and or less income tend to be less willing to take risks in their purchasing decisions. So they probably had more concerns about whether or not the remanufactured battery would last as long. Well, it won't, and we disclose that, but they might be worried that, because it's been used in another application, it would be more likely to fail and cost them more money overall. So that's the first example I have. And that would be kind of the classic accepted way that people have considered the importance of interdisciplinary energy research in the past. I think the opportunities go way beyond that, particularly the issues we're facing right now with solar deployment across the US and the really ambitious goals that both utility companies and some state governments and also the federal government have put into place. So one of the examples I wanted to talk about is that I'm working with the city of Lansing right now to identify solar sites within the city, places where we could have ground mount solar that would be more accessible to specific point of use energy demand, such as the former Harry Hill High School in South Lansing, but also places where low-income communities would have access to solar energy. So the standard way of selecting solar sites is primarily technological. So you would identify places with good solar resources and empty land or land that's perceived to be empty. And you would use modeling software to plan out the size of the installation, the location within a so-called vacant area, and the design of the solar array. And the people who design these softwares present them as this is, the best and most comprehensive way to choose a solar site and design a solar power plant. So what we want to do in our project, and I'm working with an NGO that is trying to work with municipalities across the country, smaller ones that haven't had as many opportunities so far in solar deployment and might not have as much expertise on staff. So what we want to do is bring together that modeling with social science, humanities, and arts research to really design projects that are a good fit with the community, that bring tangible benefits to the local community, and that are accepted to by the local community. So what we initially heard about this site, we kind of first saw it in the midst of COVID lockdowns on GIS, was this is an empty lot that's not being used for anything. And having studied a sense of place around solar development and energy deployment for a long time, I was a bit skeptical about that. So I went to the building once things kind of opened up and interviewed all the building users. There are a number of people renting, including still some educational service providers in that building. And then I also sent a survey to a sample of houses that are close to this facility to understand people's perceptions and ideas and values and potential conflicts about using a portion of this site for solar power. And so what I found was for the community, keeping the revenue within the community is a big priority. And that is also a priority of the Biden administration right now through the Justice 40 initiative. But it was actually a little bit less of a priority than making sure that there were a lot of plants and vegetation on the site, including plants with pollinator value and with aesthetic value. People were interested in fruit trees. And then we also learned a lot about how important this area is for outdoor recreation within this community. And so initially we were told you could use this whole space. That certainly turned out not to be true. Then the question is, could we use the revenue from the solar installation to be able to improve the recreational values for that site? So that could include resurfacing the track that has kind of fallen into disrepair since this is no longer a high school, but it's still really frequently used for exercise by people in the community. Having playground equipment, developing walking paths around the solar facility. These were all ways that, potentially the revenue from this site could offer those opportunities that wouldn't be available if you don't have the solar facility there. There were a handful of people in the survey who just really like to see the open green space, and that is a concern that would be difficult to address or mitigate. But there were a lot of people who also saw great opportunities here. For the building users, the community center there does use a portion of this space. They loved the idea as long as they have some space. And if that space is improved, including with better lighting for the outdoor recreation they have there, they would be excited about that. But it definitely adjusted the design in terms of how large of a facility we thought we might want to try to develop here. A lot of the building users, like I said, still work in education. So there's shop classes that happen in this building. There's a school lunch cooking that goes on in this building. There's the print shop for the school district. And so there are a lot of people in the building who still really see themselves as educators. And so they were excited about the educational initiatives. And what we found through the survey too was that there is a higher rate of acceptance from people who value the potential for education at this site. So the community center is interested in using this to design their summer programs around on energy and sustainability. The police precinct here, their community outreach program was excited about the opportunities for kind of greening the police force and community outreach and education for kids. There is a film studio within this facility, and they do virtual and augmented reality. And they said, oh, we could design really cool things here where educational features would pop up on your phone, or we could even design games that you could pull up on your phone in conjunction with the solar facility. So it met the educational mission of a lot of the building users. We did find, though, a lot of the people who responded to the survey don't use this building. So there is kind of a disconnect between the building users and the surrounding community. And then, of course, people in the building valued reducing the cost of electricity, which this project will do for the school district. And there's a great community garden site here that uses quite a bit of energy. And they love the idea of having some of that come from solar and to do garden and energy sustainability tours for members of the public. This picture on the top is an example of a mural that was integrated into a community solar project in Chicago. So for that project, there was some pushback from the community that the aesthetics didn't match the community. It includes battery storage, which we would want to include on this site, but that battery storage to scale just ends up looking like these big shipping containers that you plop down in a neighborhood. And so we're also wanting to work with local artists and with kids from the Lansing School District and from the Senior Citizen Program at the Community Center to incorporate intergenerational art projects on this site. So this is an example of just, one site selection, but we have this major solar deployment issue across the US. But this is, one example that I think shows how many different disciplines we would really benefit from having involved in municipal solar energy projects. So my last and related example is on agrivoltaics, which is the combination between farming and solar power on agricultural lands. So we have a record amount of utility scale solar power proposed right now for the Midwest, and much of it is for farmland. So we're starting to see a lot of conflicts between the use of land for food production versus for energy production, and a lot of concerns about the kind of socioeconomic impacts on communities. So a number of technologists, engineers have recommended agrivoltaics as a kind of techno fix to this challenge to combine farming and solar on the same site. I think that to make that work and move it beyond a techno fix to something that's a good fit that brings benefit to the community, we need lots of different disciplines talking to each other, and that includes social science and the aesthetic components, which are not simply aesthetic, but it also relates closely to the identity and culture of communities. We also need ag economists to be looking at how do these changes and conversion of land affect local agricultural economies, and can you develop different types of crops that actually have a clear market and will bring benefit to farmers, especially as these are new technologies that could bring a lot of risk. And in the interview research we've done, we found that the different stakeholders from the different disciplines and sectors are not really talking to one another right now. So the people who are focused on the farming aspect don't know a lot about energy, vice versa, and so on and so forth, kind of across like 10 different disciplinary areas. And I think MSU is really well positioned to contribute to this challenge. So those are my 3 examples. I want to finish up by talking a little bit about how how there are kind of some institutional and individual barriers to this kind of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. Some of them you'll be familiar with, but just kind of to reflect on how can we move this kind of work forward. So one of the main challenges that has been identified are the issues with funding. And that happens at a couple different scales. So this is part of this I'm taking from an article from Energy Policy, and it's kind of provocatively called, "Should We Quit Our Jobs? Barriers, Challenges, and Recommendations for Interdisciplinary Energy Research." They do come to the conclusion we shouldn't quit our jobs. We should persevere, but we need to address some of these barriers. So as many of you probably know, the SBE Directorate of NSF only receives about 3% of the overall budget each year. So that's the 2019 percentage. That's pretty common. And then of course, we don't have much representation at all from the arts and humanities in this, from this funding agency. Up until very recently, DOE was not funding any social science at all. But the exciting thing is I see that starting to change very quickly under this administration. There has been very pronounced interest in social science and even humanities work on energy justice and solar deployment from DOE. So that's really exciting to see. Often we see that the funding criteria and evaluative mechanisms are not fully aligned with interdisciplinary research, particularly those that cross disciplinary cultures, clusters from arts to humanities, social science, natural science, engineering, right? And even for some of the programs at NSF that are explicitly labeled as interdisciplinary or convergence research, we have definitely, and I'm sure other people have had this experience who are on the Zoom today, we have gotten reviews back where it does seem like it went to a disciplinary STEM panel and we don't really see the social science aspects even represented in the reviews. So this is a challenge at the federal level. At the institutional level, I would just say sometimes there's a kind of a misunderstanding that the social science and humanities scholars don't need very much funding to do their research. This is a bit of a myth. So in some ways, we tend not to need laboratory equipment, right? But it's very, very time-intensive research that we do. So it is important to, make sure that on a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research proposal that all disciplines are getting a substantive portion of the budget and that there's ample time to meet beforehand and try to understand everybody's needs, at least in terms of the funding. I think corporate and foundation funding are pretty interesting avenues of funding this research. I'm kind of surprised. I think 6 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that, but I've had some fairly good experiences working with funded research from corporations because they are facing social and socio-technical challenges in the field. And so they see it as germane to their business opportunities. And I've had some good experience working with foundations as well. So I think it's also a way to kind of promote cross-sector collaboration, but of course you have to make sure you carefully negotiate the potential conflicts of interest and the potential misunderstandings across those sectors. And then often these funding opportunities come with lower F&A, which can make them less valued in the RPT process or maybe less valued by departments and universities. So furthering a little bit more, getting into the weeds of some of the financial challenges to this, it's really important for interdisciplinary research to have some concrete budgetary and administrative support and ideally grant writing support as well, because you need these proposals to read kind of with one voice seamlessly. And often we're working with pretty challenging timescales. So I think particularly concrete budgetary support at the college and the university levels would be needed. And this is not a criticism of OSP, but just kind of a observation about how we've set it up. It's somewhat split up by college and therefore by discipline. So sometimes it can be challenging in the last minutes of getting budgets approved when people are not used to seeing some of the line items that might be common in another disciplinary area. So I think this is a very addressable issue. once we're aware of the challenges. And then for international research, this budgeting process becomes even harder, and really helping people think, how do we get enough resources to this project to make the domestic and the international portions across disciplines work is a challenge. So interdisciplinary seed funding, like we had in the past through Science and Society at State, and like we have now through, to some extent through C4I, those opportunities can help a lot. But I would also say that we need explicit interdisciplinary collaboration resources and even requirements for interdisciplinary teams. So both when people apply for this funding, really prioritizing those cross-cluster interdisciplinary collaborations, and collaborations that include public engagement and cross-sector collaboration will be important. But we also, like I said at the beginning, need explicit methods like the toolbox and other methods and visualization to make these projects work well. So some other institutional challenges have to do with various types of marginalization. So I know this term sounds a bit harsh, but I think it is helpful for us to think through the challenges. So Benjamin Sovacool, who's a leading energy and social science researcher, uses the term disciplinary chauvinism to focus on some disciplines more than others. And it's common for social science, and particularly for humanities and arts, to be seen as kind of an add-on to a STEM project where the funder wants to see some sort of humanities, social policy, regulatory aspect to the research. But there are some real demands on social scientists' time. We're also often expected to do the translation work, to learn the language of the other discipline and be able to speak to it. But I also want to acknowledge this can work in both directions. So one of my international proposals, I had invited on a variety of disciplines, and one person said like, oh, I'm usually kind of tokenizing the social scientist, and here I'm kind of tokenized because what you need is an extension person, but I'm not sure what research question I could get out of this. I don't know if I could publish from it, but it will place a lot of demands on my time. So really overcoming that, I think, is, again, addressable, but requires some explicit work. And then, of course, on top of issues with kind of disciplinary marginalization, we have existing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we need to take a close look at how disciplinary teams are bifurcated based on race, gender, sex, age, and other forms of identity, and whether people who are from more diverse backgrounds are getting the same opportunities to be PIs on these proposals and co-PIs as other individuals are. And then finally, for transdisciplinary research, there's a major outreach component. And we have this great model of that with extension services. Arguably, even extension services are underfunded, but we don't have much of a funding mechanism for the outreach work that is part of transdisciplinary energy research. But it is very time consuming, and typically that work is allocated to the social sciences and humanities. So I would also like to address joint appointments. So joint appointments are often posed as a solution to get more transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research. I think that they can work in some cases. I think it's really important to avoid cost shares and have both disciplines have a substantive appointment in two different places. I think this would work much better for senior scholars, people who are already tenured, than putting junior faculty in those positions, because they are kind of high risk, potentially high reward situations. But with our time demands through RPT, it can be hard to achieve all of the goals while trying to invest in this kind of risky research. Of course, an MOU is needed prior to day one. I think we all acknowledge that, but sometimes it doesn't happen. And there needs to be visibility in both units. So colleagues and administrators are fully informed of the goals and what is trying to be, accomplished here. And then finally, I think especially for joint appointments with the residential colleges, we don't have graduate students. So there's a substantive issue with figuring out how does one find graduate students to help with this time-consuming work and to be educated in interdisciplinary research when their joint appointment home does not have a graduate program. So then finally, I want to move to the individual challenges, and I will wrap up just in a minute. So I love this metaphor that Veranda Montgomery uses in her work on academic mentoring. And she talks about how junior scholars often act like potted plants because it kind of reduces the risk for them to maintain their ecosystem that's kind of nimble and movable. But what you want for, retention for interdisciplinary research is people to start to settle into the fertile soil and to grow roots. And the picture I found was of a rhizome, which I think works well for interdisciplinary research because you want these tendrils to be popping up across different areas of the research. But that is a lot of risk for a junior faculty member because it comes with a lot of extra costs and potentially fewer rewards, or maybe greater rewards, but that time horizon might not be aligned with RPT. The other thing I've noticed is, I think universally, not just with interdisciplinary research, there's a lack of funding for the actual publications that come out of the end of the research process. And that's even harder for interdisciplinary research because even those journals that say that they're interdisciplinary often choose disciplinary reviewers. There aren't a lot that are actually cluster interdisciplinary journals. And so we sent our Second Life battery paper to a journal where we got very disciplinary reviews back and said, we're going to have to revise this and just completely send it somewhere else. Finding the time to do that is really challenging. And then, I think with those higher fixed costs come kind of higher individual risks that would need to be mitigated to get this kind of rhizomatic situation. So just briefly in conclusion, I've talked about how interdisciplinary energy research is really crucial for energy innovation, energy equity, climate change mitigation. Transdisciplinary research that includes that community engagement and stakeholder engagement is very important, especially for renewable energy deployment. But in terms of facilitating that research, we have some structures and individual barriers and risks that can impede that, that we'll all need to work together to start to come up with solutions to overcome. So with that, I'm really excited to take your questions, and thanks for your attention, especially on this beautiful sunny day.
Thanks so much, Sharlissa. That was a remarkably rich presentation. Please, everyone, if you have a question, put it in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar if you prefer. We have one question that is from Stephanie that concerns the types of visualizations you are interested in. And I'd like to, I hope Stephanie doesn't mind if I do this, I'd like to kind of add to that, maybe as a part B, how you have seen or could imagine visualization functioning as a kind of training tool or training environment for people who are learning how to do the kind of work that you do, right? So we use, as you mentioned, Toolbox a couple of times, and that focuses on using dialogue to help people acquire ability and enhanced capacity to engage in this kind of work. And I'm kind of curious how visualization could function to do something like that.
Yeah, those are great questions. I'm happy to talk about that. So I got this idea because in some of my interdisciplinary collaboration with engineers, engineers are great about visualizing data, and I've learned a lot about it over the last 6 years. I've realized how much I have to learn about visualizing data. So we used just draw.io, which is like an add-on to Google Drive, just to start to sketch out what does our research problem look like. And I think we all learned a lot, just even, it's kind of a circle and arrow diagram, just by seeing which variables people included. Of course, we wouldn't all see them as variables, but within that environment, that's usually our starting point in hypodeductive research. But also seeing like which direction people were drawing arrows and what things they thought were connected to other things. I started to better understand the epistemology through which my collaborators were viewing the challenges. And that also helped me to be able to articulate, here's why I see this part differently, because now I'm getting much better understanding of how you're picturing it. Here's how my part is picturing it. I remember, I think just the project before that with those same collaborators, one of my engineering colleagues said, the more you talk about what you do, the less I understand it. And that's not good. And I was like, no, it's not good, but it's also really common. And we went from there to using this visualization and starting to understand one another. The other thing that I'm really interested in terms of visualization is the wonderful 360 room in the MSU library. I've been having a great time taking 360 video of our energy transition in Michigan. So I've traveled all over, I've taken lots of video of infrastructure, and then I've done a number of interviews across sectors. And it's gotten a little bit delayed by COVID, but it's getting close to done. I've been putting those together to try to tell a narrative about our energy transition, but also to help to teach people about the scale at which we consume energy, the scale at which we're replacing infrastructure right now, but try to help people understand the aesthetic dimensions of that, the community values, the stakeholder perspectives, so that people, I mean, we have a first challenge of just characterizing and understanding this energy transition before we can influence it in positive ways. And so I've used this in some classes so far, and I've seen good learning from it. So, I mean, I haven't had the chance to experiment with this, but what I want to do next is if we meet in that space and all disciplines are able to bring a 360 photo, and they're getting easier, the technology is getting easier to access, getting easier to take, and then we can have dialogue around that photo where there's kind of concrete visual aspects to talk about and talk through. And we can talk about what's within the frame of the picture, even in the 360 view, and what's excluded, you know, who's visualized in this, who is left out, who sees this, right? So for coal-fired power plants, that's disproportionately low income communities of color, and who doesn't, for whom is this landscape kind of invisible. So I haven't managed to get funding for that work yet, although I've been working on it. But I think from the social science side, I've gotten the pushback that it just sounds like a bit too techno-utopian. And so I think, right, it's like there is this artifact that is this new high technology. And it's like, oh, you're becoming obsessed with that and not actually how we co-create knowledge. And I think the only way to see whether or not that's the case is to start to experiment with it. And maybe that's not the best technology. Maybe that's like the kind of new cool thing we have, but I do really think it would help, but it's kind of yet to be proven. So yeah, thanks for this question.
Yeah. We have a question in the Q&A that I'm answering. We'll answer live. Are we making any progress at MSU at lowering the institutional barriers for interdisciplinary research? And where would you start?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Well, let me address it this way. So I think I would start with, you know, ideally, I would love to see the science and society at state funding rekindled in addition to the C4I seed funding. And Science and Society at State has been working on trying to build the program more into a network and to provide some more training opportunities. So making that more robust for my area is really exciting. I'd love to see us have an explicit center in which maybe just, I think probably most best would be an expansion of the Center for Interdisciplinary, where we have people before they have funding, when they're in that like early stage of cooperation coming in. Right now it's hard because I think you need the funding to be able to move forward, right? But being able to do that on the front of that process, it's an ongoing process, but even so much is dependent on that funding proposal. And if it goes through, sometimes the shortfalls and the funding structure in terms of how it's been allocated across the disciplines, it's like pretty, has some momentum behind it. It's pretty difficult to change. So having that up front, I mean, I think like the help concrete assistance that's affordable and accessible in writing interdisciplinary funding narratives, and also getting the budgetary parts, you know, right. I think and the budgetary part is maybe the easiest part to fix. I just haven't heard a lot of attention on it being kind of an issue, right? So then I would love to see an evaluation of how our joint appointments that are particularly across clusters, how are those going? What are, gathering, these are kind of my reflections on the last 6 years. I'm curious how it's going for other people and gathering that insight and seeing what's actionable from it. And then I think we've talked a little bit about this, and I wish I had better answers, but I think just even starting to have the conversation around disciplinary marginalization, diversity, equity, inclusion, and kind of expectations about what level of funding, what discipline needs, just even starting to have, we talked about doing a colloquium on that, even just starting to have the discussion, maybe collecting the data to see, are there disparities in who's PI or co-PI, or just playing a much more minor part of a proposal. What does that look like in terms of the composition of our faculty and our grad students who have access to those opportunities? So I would start with some of those kind of concrete things like the budgeting process and move toward institutions and training opportunities that will take longer and more investment to start to build out.
Thank you. Yeah, all of those as steps forward certainly resonate with me. I mean, we try to do that work, or at least facilitate that work a little bit through the center. Yeah. And I agree, if were we to do these things, which antecedently requires the will to do these things, but we're all that in place, I think that would definitely improve the situation for interdisciplinary scholars on campus. Thank you. Another question from Stephanie. What's your perspective on expanded notions of extension? For example, MSU is launching a humanities extension that is coupling the extension model with humanities research. And just curious your thoughts on extending extension.
I love that. Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't realize that. I'm really excited to hear that. So, I mean, I think particularly for agrivoltaics, there's already some infrastructure in place. We do have an energy and agriculture expert, Charles Gould, in extension, but there's one of him and a lot of work to do. I think he would say that himself. The picture I showed of the sheep under solar panels, he organized that pasture walk last week or the week before, and it was just fabulous. I learned so much. I saw the people who attended learning so much. It was really exciting to just be out in the field I've heard so much about solar grazing, and like finally out in the field with people who do solar grazing, and they have such a fabulous network to bring people together. So if we had a more expanded portion of energy extension, particularly since so much of this is focusing on agricultural land, I think it could potentially even be within CANR. But I do think having arts and humanities as part of that, having energy social science and energy policy, and we have wonderful regulatory work related to energy going on campus as well. So bringing all of that existing expertise, but we would need explicit outreach funding, because really what needs to happen, first we need to work together, right? But it's the transdisciplinary part is so important for this renewable energy deployment challenge, and being out there in the field, talking to the farmers who are considering solar leasing or selling their land for solar. And then at the municipal level, I meant to mention, but I don't think I did. So all of the participation by my engineering colleagues who are doing the modeling. We also didn't have hourly load data for this site, which I think is going to be true for a lot of low-income communities, but you have to have that to design a solar system. So my engineering colleagues completely volunteered, and their grad students. They've done all of this work for free. I paid for the survey to go out. I've paid for my transcript. So we have not found funding for this project, although with the new opportunities coming out of DOE, I think maybe it will be available. But that is really, I think we'll be able to publish. I think I'll be able to publish from it. Might be harder for my engineering colleagues unless we're able to find an interdisciplinary journal to publish together. So that's a a lot of outreach volunteerism that it would be great to see find an institutional home, maybe within ag extension.
Great, thank you. There are no questions, so I'm going to assert the host's prerogative and ask one myself. And I'm curious about the notion of marginalization. And on the slide that you walked through that concerned it, you tended to focus a little bit, I think, on marginalization within the team, right? So how, like, by sort of foregrounding disciplinary chauvinism as a construct for making sense out of marginalization in these projects, what that makes salient is the difference in power between the disciplines and teammates when it comes to collaborations around complex topics like this. But there's also marginalization on the side of the community, right? So this is, you know, this is the old news about transdisciplinarity, right? Is that you know, you really need to, it really helps, especially since you're working on problems that are often community problems, to involve the community and not just sort of solve their problems for them and then kind of parachute in with your solutions and expect that to work, right? And so there's a kind of, you might even argue, a structural considerations that marginalize the community from the beginning, or that you have to at least acknowledge and attempt to overcome. I'm curious, in these examples that you've used and you talked about in your own experience, if that resonates with you, does that seem true to you? And what are your thoughts about how we might address that and remedy it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I wasn't thinking just in terms of the teams themselves, but also what teams get formed and who gets invited on them at the university scale and even the kind of national academic ecosystem scale as well. And then, yeah, certainly with transdisciplinary research, I mean, even the different stakeholder groups also have a lot of power. So when I've worked with energy industry, it makes it much harder to work with people who are facing problematic solar siting proposals in their community, because obviously I'm coming in with an alignment with the energy industry that has a lot more power. And I had a really interesting conversation with a community stakeholder who I asked to do an interview, who was saying, like, why should I spend my time educating the industry? And they were really generous and were willing to talk through that with me. Did an interview where I just learned so much, and I have an obligation now to figure out how to convey that. I mean, so yeah, absolutely. It's the problem just almost grows exponentially between the interdisciplinary and the transdisciplinary.
Yeah.
And it's integrative and additive as well, because the disputes within the, you know, among the academic researchers and disciplines is going to also affect your community partners and stakeholders. I mean, so I'm always advocating at least for training for everybody up front in diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's, you know, the first thing. But then I also think having a diversity point person who can do ongoing kind of evaluation of how are things going in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion across the stakeholders. How do we develop mechanisms so people can report things early and often and get them addressed before they balloon? But, you know, ultimately, I think it's going to go, those are kind of the procedural things, but it's going to go even further than that. And so much of it is decided in terms of what projects actually happen and who's at the table. And I think that's a funding and kind of tangible issue of institutional support.
Thank you. That seems right to me. Thanks everyone for your time. We have reached the end of this University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for your presentation and your excellent answers to the questions. And we hope that if you have time in a couple of weeks that you'll join us again. Take care, everybody.